Welcome to Brooklands Members TV and Podcasts. I'm Steve Clarke, and I'm delighted to be joined by the motorsport writer, broadcaster, and editorial consultant, Maurice Hamilton.
Hello, Steve. Lovely to see you.
Maurice, it's great to have you with us today. Now, we're here to chat about your latest book, Biography of Niki Lauda, which I have to say I found fascinating.
Thank you. Good.
But before we start, I have to ask, yesterday's first Grand Prix of 2020. I put my T-shirt on. What a result for McLaren. Do you think they found something, or is it just the flourishing partnership with Renault?
No, well, it's a combination of lots of things, because you're looking at that race, any number of things could have happened. Lewis Hamilton might have won it. Max Verstappen might have won it. You're almost saying that, the McLaren story, he was there. I mean, I think what we can't deny, regardless of circumstances, is that the McLaren partnership with Renault at the moment, the way that car is working with Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz is good. I mean, they're up there, and they were expecting Racing Point to be ahead of them, but in fact, I think they've come out a bit ahead of Racing Point.
And I seem to recall they got Lando got fastest lap of the race, didn't he?
That's phenomenal, because it's the end of the race, 71 laps.
Yeah,
the tires cannot have been at their best, and he really knew he had to do it, and he went for it, and he didn't make any mistakes. No. That, I think, it may sound a bit rude to say this, but he kind of almost grew up over the weekend.
Yeah, could be. Yeah,
this will be the making of him, I'm sure.
Yeah, and to pull McLaren out of the doldrums that they've been in for so long, so it could be a good shortened season. We don't know.
No, well, the signs are brilliant. I mean, Mercedes. Okay, so Valtteri Bottas leads from start to finish. It sounds like, oh, here we go again, but it wasn't like that at all. And I mean, they've got reliability problems, which of course is, with the greatest respect to them, I'm sorry to say this, but it's what we need.
Yeah, we do. We do, absolutely. Something a little bit different in the mix.
Yeah.
So, Maurice, the book. First of all, what prompted you to write it? And it had been a long time planning thing, or was it something that you just hadn't expected to do?
I think it's the latter, Steve, actually, to be honest with you. I had no thought about doing a book on Niki Lauda. It hadn't entered my head until the week when he passed away in May 2019. Like everybody else, I read the obituaries and all the thoughts about him. And what really struck me was that, apart from finding them in the motorsport press where you would expect them, there were tributes to him from all around the world in all sorts of publications. And it struck me that he was obviously well known to us inside motorsport. And you would expect, he is probably well known outside the sport because he ran an airline, and people might remember 1976 and the big accident which he recovered from a long time ago. But what really became clear was that he was actually quite a sporting icon, not just within motorsport. And there was a lot to his story, and I hadn't really thought about it, And I'm very, very fortunate in that I have a very good literary agent, David Luxon. I've been with him 15 odd years. And I was mulling this over, and David came on the phone to me the same day. It was literally on the couple of days after he passed away, asking me the same question: do you think there's a book in this? And I suddenly thought, do you know what? I think there might be.
Well,
that's what led to it. So it really wasn't something I'd been planning, but something when I thought about it, hey, come on, why not?
Yeah, I guess it was a bit of a shock to a lot of people, the global status that he'd actually had grown around him over the years, because he wasn't that big in Formula One for quite a while, was he?
No, I mean, his start was what you might call shaky. Because he was a guy, when he first appeared, he seemed like a rich kid with more money than sense, as is sometimes the case, because when he arrived in 71, driving a Formula 2 car, he'd backing from a bank loan, money he borrowed from a bank, and he didn't really do a huge amount. He bought a March, and he thought, okay, so what? And he didn't really set the tracks on a light in 71. And then in 72, when he got the Formula 1 driver, or he paid for the the 72 Formula One driver March, because of course, Lauda being Lauda, he was very shrewd in that he realized that March would take you on board if you had the money. They were getting pretty.
Take you.
They were broke at the time, and after the first year, so he got on board with them. And even in that year, 72, of course, it was a dog of a car. The 721X was an awful car, and it didn't do anything for him. So there we were, 2 years into his international racing career, if you like, and he hadn't done anything. Yeah. And why would you want to pay much attention to him? Yeah. The only kind of clues you got were there used to be a British Formula 2 championship. It was a small thing. It was about 5 races, and one of them was at Oulton Park on the wet, and he won it. Yeah. And he looked fantastic. I mean, really, really good. And anybody in the wet, you think, hello. And
something different.
Yeah, and that was the start of it.
Just winding the clock back slightly, Maurice. When did you get to meet him for the first time? And I have to say, was it a challenge? Was he a challenge to interview?
Yeah, that's the answer. But I had been warned. So the first formal interview I did with him was in 1982 at the Detroit Grand Prix. He was making his comeback. So he'd retired at the end of 79, and he was making his comeback with McLaren. And he'd already won the Long Beach Grand Prix, which is his 3rd race of his comeback with McLaren, which is quite something. You know, a guy comes back and he wins a Grand Prix, and he wins it on merit, by the way, as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought I really need to do a feature on this, and my good friend, the late Alan Henry, was a good close friend of Niki, because Alan and Niki had sort of grown up together through Formula 2. Alan was reporting on Formula 2 for Motoring News, and they got to know each other really well, and they had a similar sense of humor. And I said to Alan, would you introduce me, please, to Niki, because I want to ask, can I come and see him later in the weekend? And Alan said, yeah, sure. I said, but one word of warning. If they spring it on you, he may say to you, do it now. Okay. And I said, well, okay. And this was in between free practice sessions on the Friday in Detroit, right? So he'd got out of his car, he'd talked to his engineer, and the pit lane in Detroit was open. It was open air. There was no garages. Cars were garaged a long way away in Cobo Hall. So there's all this chaos and mayhem. And Alan takes me up to him and introduces me to him. And he looks at me and he says, okay, start, do it now. And luckily, I had the tape recorder in my hand, because just in case he said the questions in my head. And what he's doing is, and other journalists told me the same thing when I was doing the book, that he does that to you to see if you're any good, put you on your mettle.
Yeah.
If you are good, then you get all the answers you want. If you're not, you get dismissed.
You're out.
Pretty quickly. Yeah. So the first interview was interesting, let's say. Yeah.
I first watched Lauda at the 1973 Race of Champions at Brands Hatch. Oh, yeah. And as you well know, he was driving the BRM P160. And in common with most BRM races at that time, expired on lap 29, having qualified a very credible second on the grid. But there was something about him then, Maurice. You'd obviously followed him a lot long before then.
I'd actually been at Mallory Park in March 1971 when he made his Formula 2 debut, his international debut. And as I said, I was intrigued by this kid who appeared to have money but not a lot of talent, but yet why was he there? And there was just some sort of aura about him. And I had visions of, I was trying to get into motorsport at the time. I wasn't actually a journalist at the time. I was trying to get in. I was a fan. And I'd thought that maybe I'd be a photographer rather than a journalist. And I had the camera and all the lens and all the trick bits. And I was going through the paddock at Mallory Park, and I saw this Niki Lauda chap settling into the cockpit of his car. There was nobody else around him apart from one mechanic, because the whole of the March personnel were over there around Ronnie Peterson, as you would.
Of course.
I just moved in close and took this picture, which really worked out. It turned out really nice. In fact, it was we used it in the book.
It's in the book, yeah.
And I used that then as an introduction to do a long interview with him much later. You're talking about the first interview in Detroit. Well, much this is the picture I took, and I showed that to him 40 odd years later. So, but my introduction, I had been following him. And interesting, you mentioned 73, Steve, because the British Grand Prix also, he had a stonking race there until, again, the BRM broke. They'd had the first lap crash, if you remember, and that knocked a few people out. But he was really on it in that race until the car expired. And then in 73 also in the wet Canadian Grand Prix, again, it was wet. And he, I think, was leading actually for a period, or right up there. So yeah, with the BRM, it wasn't the best car, as you know, but boy, did he make good use of it. And then it was Monaco.
Yeah, he did.
He did it. Put it on his door handles at Monaco and led to two Ferraris.
And of course, it was the V12 engine that powered it at that time as well.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, which he always said was a little bit down on horsepower. Mr. Stanley, the owner of Louis Stanley, would assure him that they would have more horsepower for the next race. To which Niki said,
but they never did.
No.
Maurice, did you feel you had enough background to write this book?
Yeah, that's interesting, Steve, because when David, my agent, said to me, could you think you could write the book? I had already been thinking along those lines, and I'd been looking things up, and I was thinking about the interviews I had, which I had quite a few going right back, as I say, to 1982. But I have, I've got an A to Z filing system. And this is the days before we had computers and before, you know, we've got all the resources we've got now, before we had Google and so on.
Sure.
Well, you had to keep cuttings. So, and I had an A to Z system. And I went, and I haven't looked at it for years, because why should you? You know, you just go online and you've got everything you need. And I thought, I must go and try and find. So I went to that. Not only did I have a file, but instead of just under L, you go through the L and there's all the drivers whose names began with L. There was one for Lauda, and it was thick with stuff that I had completely forgotten I had. Cuttings from Motoring News from the 70s, cuttings from interviews with him after his accident in 77 from the Daily Express, and things like that. And I found I had a wealth of background stuff that I had completely forgotten about, and wonderful quotes in it that I thought, well, I can really use this. So that also reassured me and gave me the confidence to tackle the book.
Yeah. One thing I have to admit, Maurice, that I'd not thought, since you've been saying there's this wealth of information that went into the popular press that wouldn't normally have found its way in there. I know this is a bit of a difficult one, but if he'd not had that horrific accident, do you think he would have been so well known?
Probably not. He would have certainly had a certain notoriety because of the ongoing championship fight with James Hunt, which was gaining a lot of headlines. And I mean, it was a great story. Prior to the accident, it was a great story because if you remember, there were nip and tuck, and then James wins the British Grand Prix and Ferrari protests and James gets thrown out and all the rest of it. But I think the truth of the matter is, if Niki hadn't had the accident, he would have won that championship.
Yeah, I'm sure, without a doubt.
So he would have been just another Ferrari driver wins the championship. Our boy James gets hard done by, blah blah. And no, I think that's fair comment, because the story of the accident, which is a horrendous accident, and then the comeback. I mean, in sport, never mind motorsport, just in sport, you know, we talk about Tiger Woods' comeback in golf last year, which was pretty impressive. But Lauda's comeback as sporting comeback, that fight back after the 2 months after the accident at the Nürburgring, is quite incredible. What he did to get back in that car and finish fourth at Monza. You know, the pressure of getting back in the car, getting back in a Ferrari, doing it at Monza, of all places, huge pressure. To do all that, and then to take the fight, to continue the fight with James right up to the last race in Fuji. That really caught the public's imagination. And I think you're probably right, Steve. Without that, it probably wouldn't have been the same.
No, I mean, when you look at that Japanese Grand Prix, the guy had some balls to say, I'm only doing a couple of laps and I'm out. You know, despite what Mr. Ferrari was going to say. And I recall the mechanic saying, shall we say that there was a problem with the engine? And Lauda said, no, I've just had enough. And that, to me, showed the mettle of the man.
It did. I mean, that was probably the second bravest thing he did after making the comeback a couple of months before at Monza, to do that for all the reasons you've said, Steve, because when you're driving for Ferrari, I mean, Ferrari, we have to accept, is the next best thing motorsport's got to a national team.
Yeah.
The whole of Italy feels they own Ferrari. When you're driving for Ferrari, it's not so much the driver they care about the team. And so he was out, he had the pressure of winning for Ferrari, winning for the whole of Italy. And they knew they would have been watching, they knew the expectation was high. And then, of course, in the background is the specter of old man Ferrari, who you have to answer to if you don't do it. So he had all that going on, but yet he knew, I suppose, what we have to say, Steve, is that his values about life, and particularly his life, were totally changed by what happened to him, the near-death experience at the Nürburgring, would make you think differently about how you run your life. And to him, the risk was too high. Yeah. And he wasn't afraid to say it. And you're absolutely right. It was Daniel Odetto said to him, shall we say it's electrics in the rain, you know? And he said, no, just say I stopped. Yeah. And he wasn't afraid to say it, but that is the mark of the man, not just the courage to do that, but also this ability just to say it exactly
how you feel.
Yeah. Calls it exactly as it is. Wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Maurice, remind me, there have been other books written about Lauda before, have there not?
Yes, there have, Steve, but that's actually a good point, because in this process of discussing, do we do a book or do we not on him, that question came up. And I thought about it, and the one book the last book that he did in English was To Hell and Back, which was in 1987. And it was a brilliant book. I mean, I remember being absolutely rapt when it came out, loving it, because I hadn't read a book that was so expressive or so frank and honest as this, and it was an absolutely brilliant book. But two things. One was he'd done a lot in his life since 1987. He'd started the airline, and there'd been the air crash, which he'd had to investigate and take on Boeing. He'd then come back into motorsport in the management roles, and with Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton and all of that. So there was that story to tell. But also, when I went back and started to read through To Hell and Back, I suddenly realized, and I hadn't noticed it at the time, and I don't suppose anybody would, but when that book was published in 87, it was done in German, first of all, and it was translated by somebody who didn't know much about motorsport, didn't know Niki Lauda, but probably did a technically correct translation, perfect translation. But in the process, they lost the voice of Niki Lauda, okay? Mm-hmm. You had this very correct English, which wasn't him. No. That's not the way he spoke. It was quite direct, boom, boom, you know?
Yeah.
It was lost.
Yeah.
And I knew that the interviews I had and other stuff I would get would be as he said it. It wouldn't be polished into good English.
Including the language.
Yeah, including the language, correct. Yeah, the salty language, Steve. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Maurice, the acknowledgements you list in the book are virtually a who's who of Formula One. And I have to say, one of the major things that came out of the book for me was the sheer number of people that you've included in the book. Phenomenal number.
I surprised myself, if I'm honest. I just made a list, thought of how many people did he know that I really need to talk to. And your hope is when you draw up this list, which is a heck of a list, is that you might get half of them. And if you get half of them, that's good. But what really hit me in a nice way was that when I approached people, they couldn't wait to help. Mm. They wanted to help. And I'll be doing things such as, for example, I was at Monza last year, and in the process of gathering as many interviews as I could, and I wanted to see Jean Alesi, and I'd arranged to have breakfast with him in the Ferrari motorhome on one of the mornings, and we're sitting there, and the media and all sorts of people are all around, and I'm talking to Jean, who was fantastic, really, really fantastic, as he always is. And I finished that. I looked around the room. I saw Mark Surer sitting at another table having his breakfast. And I said, sorry, Mark, excuse me. I was just been talking. And he said, yeah, I heard. I said, could I talk to you? Yeah, good. I've got a story. Bang, bang. Mm. And there was a French cameraman, Jean-Michel Teto, sitting. Yeah, And everybody had a Lauda story. And the more I asked, the more I found.
Yeah, and the more they wanted to tell you, I guess.
Yeah, and it just gave it the flow, because that's what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do more than anything else was to have this book tell you what this guy Niki Lauda was like. What was he like? You know, a lot of people knew what he'd done, obviously, but they didn't really know, because he wasn't a guy who showed his emotions much. He wasn't a guy who talked a lot, didn't like to talk a lot about himself. So I wanted to tell the story about who he was, and I hope I've achieved that.
Mm. Well, he certainly have, from my point of view. Just on that subject, the Lauda family, did you have to get their approval to go forward with it?
I didn't have to, Steve, but I thought I should.
Yeah.
I thought it would be really nice if I could do that. It would make me feel better. And the problem here was that I'd never met either of the two boys, Lucas or Matthias. But I got, Lucas is the elder of the two, and I got his email thanks to Bradley Lord at Mercedes. And I just simply emailed him and said, introduced myself, said what I wanted to do, said what I had, more or less what we just discussed, actually. This is how it's come about.
Yeah.
This is what I like to do. I like to talk to people. I like to tell the story of your father. And I sent some of the pictures of me interviewing him in '82 to show that I wasn't just, you know, I'd been around the block a few times with him.
Sure.
And crossed my fingers. Said, can I do the book? Would you mind if I did this? Crossed my fingers. The next day, the phone rang. I picked it up, and I nearly dropped the phone because it sounded like it was Niki himself. Hello, Maurice. Okay, Lucas Lauda here. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Good. We got your email. Yes. Go. Do. Thank you. Goodbye. Fine. I thought, great.
You're off. Yeah.
I'm off, and that is nice to know.
Yeah.
But it's also very good when you go to, for example, Toto Wolff, who was very, very close to the Lauda family, and I went to Toto and said what I was doing. And I said, first of all, can I say I've got the approval of the family? He said, fine, I'm happy to help. Because up until that point, they don't want to say too much in case they cause offense. But if you say you've got the approval, it opens a lot of doors, and it helped greatly.
So effectively, you've opened the gate for their approval. So a big step forward. Maurice, looking at his Formula One career, you're obviously around and following. I think he raced in 170-something Grand Prix. How many of those do you think you actually saw in person?
Probably about 3/4, I'd say. I missed the 70s. I would go to the early 70s ones as a fan. You know, I'd do Zandvoort and Zolder. And at the weekend off work and rush across. So I really started to go to quite a few in 76. And from then on, every one. So I didn't miss any. So the early ones I missed, but other than that, no, I saw them all. Yeah.
Just looking at the film Rush, what did you think of the portrayal of Lauda in Rush?
I thought Daniel Bruhl did an absolutely wonderful job. In fact, it was so good that his portrayal of Niki before the accident in the 70s that we just referred to, there were times when I watched that and I thought, have they used old video here? Because that's just like him. He had all the mannerisms,
You're right. For me, Maurice, it was the mannerisms and the way he moved, and well, you're dead right. You had to take a second look.
Yeah. And Daniel Bruhl was one of the ones I had to talk to. I felt I really should get a hold of him, and that took a while to have. These film stars are hard. You've got to go through an agent, and I had to jump through lots of different hoops to explain what I was going to do and why and all the rest of it. And anyway, I eventually got him on the phone, and we talked for the course of an hour, and he was wonderful. And he explained the whole thing about how he had to go through it and how nervous he was about doing Niki Lauda. Very nervous because he knew who he was. He knew he was a very important person. And also there's this, because Daniel Bruhl is German, Niki Lauda is Austrian. There's a certain frisson between the two nations. And he knew that it wouldn't go down very well in Austria that he, a German, was playing their hero. So he had to overcome all of that, which he did. But he studied him at close close quarters. And in fact, he not only just watched the old video, but he went out to see him in Ibiza. And in fact, he told the story about he felt out to go and talk to him before I started to play this role. So he very nervously said, he got a message to Niki that he would like to come and see him. At 6 o'clock in the morning, his phone rang. And he could see there was a phone call. It was from Austria, and he knew it'd be Niki calling at that hour. And he told him to come to Vienna. And he said, only bring a small bag, because if I don't like you, you're going home. And he said, luckily I had to buy some more clothes because he stayed for 3 days.
Yeah. Well, he certainly made a fantastic job. Maurice, Lauda very rarely gets rated when you discuss the greatest driver of all time. He just doesn't figure in that. Why do you think that is?
You're right. He doesn't. If you're talking about the Sennas, the Schumachers of this world, he doesn't get a mention. We're talking at the highest level now, aren't we?
Of course.
I think, Steve, it's because he was very unobtrusive in his style of driving. He was the sort of guy that you wouldn't notice, because he was all using the head and minimum of effort just to get the job done, to look after the tires in the car. Very clean in the way he drove, to the point where, I'm going back to the days when, before we had computerized timing, which is now de rigueur everywhere, but at the time you would be watching out on the track with a stopwatch. And you'd watch them all go by, and Senna would come by, or whoever would come by, wheel up in the air, doing it, and you'd expect to see a fast time. You'd see the list of times, and you go, N Lauda, third or second, and you think, where did that come from? How did anybody see that? How did he do that? And that was just him. So, and he would win races the same way. He would win races almost by stealth. Suddenly he was seventh, then he was fifth, and you're busy watching the front, and then you say, oh, hello, he's fourth. And then he'd be third, he'd be looking after everything, and boom, he'd be there and do the job. So I think that's got a lot to do with it. He just wasn't spectacular, but to win 3 championships, you've
got to be good.
Yeah, correct.
Do you think the influence he had with that in mind within the Mercedes team, and especially Lewis, rubbed off onto his success?
Yes, I do. The point about Lauda is that if you talk to people like Gerhard Berger, John Lacey, and so on, that used to race with him, or when even he was running Ferrari, he was sort of managing them.
Yeah.
Was the respect that they had for him, that they felt like I've just described. You don't win 3 championships because you're no good. And it was the way he did it, and the way he went about his business, the integrity that he had. I mean, he rarely got into any nasty incidents. In fact, I can't think of any where he was doing something questionable behind the wheel. So I think they would all. Gerhard said when I was talking to him about him, he said, in the early days, I didn't really think, oh, Lauda, yeah, okay, he's another driver. And he said, it was only when afterwards I sat down, after he'd retired, and I sat down to think about what he'd done and think about how he'd done it. I thought, do you know what? This guy's something special. And then he said, I really got to know him privately, and I really began to appreciate just the makeup of this man and why he was so special, and his ability to think things through and to see things in a very, very clear light was unique, because I don't know many people could do that. So he said that was a huge help. Berger said to me personally, and probably to everybody else. And so to Lewis, yeah, I'm sure Lewis learned a thing or two from him, just, maybe even subconsciously.
Yeah, just the presence of him being there.
Yeah, correct.
On a personal note, Maurice, how many books have you written? And I know this is a tough one. How does this one rate?
Cool. Well, it's over 30 books.
Yeah, wow.
The first one was in 1986. Yeah. They all mean something, Steve, because part of you comes out. It's like somebody said, you cut a vein and you sit at the keyboard and it comes out. So part of you is in each book. So then saying that, I think any personal feeling that you've got is going to count for a lot. It's certainly right up there. The ones that I've really felt passionate about doing and really wanted to do, the Ken Tyrrell book meant a heck of a lot to me, because he was like a sort of surrogate father, a father figure to me when I was starting off. And and Tyrrell was down the road from where I was working. So I got to know him really well, and it was a pleasure. Because when he was alive, Ken wouldn't have anybody do a book. No, well, I don't want to do a book. As soon as he passed, I went to his family and got the approval and did the book, because I really wanted to tell his story.
To do it.
And it's the same with this. I think once I put my mind to it, I thought, God, this is a great story. This is something I really, really want to do and to tell. I did books with Jordan, Fly on the Wall books, 2 seasons with them, which were great fun. Thoroughly enjoyed doing those. Hadn't been done before. Working with Damon Hill, a couple of books working with him. What a pleasure to work with him. So yes, I would just go as far as Steve was saying. It's right up there amongst the ones I really feel a lot for. Yeah.
Excellent. So what's next in the pipeline then, if you can say?
Well, there's a book coming out shortly, actually, which I did last winter. It's to celebrate. It should have been launched this week, actually, at the British Grand Prix, or whenever that was supposed to be. 70 years of Formula One, and it's just a potted history. It's a history. It's just a history book with which the Formula One, the company, wanted done, and I put that together as a sort of thing for them. So that's coming out shortly. But it's a factual. Yeah, it's not. It's a nice book. It's a nice book, but wouldn't have the same sort of feeling as that. I have something else on the go, which is a very early stage. I'm afraid I can't tell you about it.
No, I understand.
As soon as I can, if it comes off, it'll be something we'll want to talk about for sure. But it's early stages yet.
Perfect. Maurice, as ever, it's been a joy to talk to you today. I wish you continued success with the book, and hopefully you'll be back at Brooklands with us before too long. Thanks for your time.
I sincerely hope so, Steve. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Nice to talk to you.
Take care.
Bye.